children, 2 passports, one decision that changed everything. On February 3rd, something happened that the British monarchy hasn't done in nearly a century. It wasn't announced on television. There were no press conferences, no official statements. But inside the walls of Windsor Castle, a line was crossed that can never be uncrossed. 2 passports were locked away. Not for security threats, not for legal violations, but because someone decided that 2 children born into royalty were being slowly erased from existence. And the person responsible, the one person who should have protected them most. Let me take you back to where this really started, because what you're about to hear isn't about palace drama or tabloid gossip. It's about what happens when silence becomes louder than words, and absence becomes proof of something far darker. Prince Harry thought it was over. After months of legal battles, sleepless nights, and tense negotiations, a custody agreement had finally been signed. The lawyer stepped back. The headlines quieted down. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was supposed to be peace. But peace never came. Instead, something started happening that nobody expected. It was subtle at first, so subtle that if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it entirely. But the people whose job it is to notice these things, they noticed. It started with a phone call on January 31st. A school administrator in Santa Barbara picked up the phone, checked the attendance records, and felt a knot form in their stomach. Archie and Lilibet hadn't shown up for the new term. Now kids miss school all the time, families travel, things come up. But here's what made this different. There was no notice, no withdrawal form, no transfer request, no explanation at all. The school waited. Surely someone would call. Surely there'd be an email, a message, something. But nothing came. So they tried reaching out themselves. Emails to Meghan Markle went unanswered. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Messages left with representatives disappeared into silence. It was like shouting into a void. By the end of that day, protocol kicked in. When children vanish from an educational system without explanation, and nobody can tell you where they went, it stops being a private family matter. It becomes a safeguarding issue, and that's when the alerts went out. What happened next is the part that still makes people inside the palace shake their heads. Because it wasn't just the school, it was everything. Child welfare monitors started digging deeper. They checked travel records, nothing. They looked for new school registrations, nothing. They searched for homeschooling applications, private tutoring arrangements, anything that would explain where these children had gone educationally. Empty. Completely empty. Then they checked medical records. And that's when the concern turned into something closer to alarm. Multiple pediatric appointments had been canceled, not rescheduled, not moved to a different provider. Just canceled. No follow-up care arranged, no new doctors registered. For children who'd been receiving regular medical oversight, it was like someone had just flipped a switch and turned everything off. Think about that for a second. Education stopped, medical care interrupted, and the person legally responsible? Unreachable. What made this even more disturbing was the timing. Everything had happened within a narrow window, almost like it had been coordinated. Schools notified on the same day. Medical appointments canceled in rapid succession. Communication channels cut off simultaneously. To the professionals monitoring the situation, this wasn't chaos. It was precision. Someone had planned this carefully, executing each step with deliberate intent. By February 2nd, the language in official communications started changing. Words like oversight and coordination disappeared. In their place came harder terms: withdrawal, obstruction, intentional severance. Someone at the palace said it best: this wasn't negligence, this was preparation. The emergency meeting at Windsor Castle wasn't scheduled through normal channels. Senior aides got a message: clear the room now. Phones were collected, assistants were dismissed. And then Princess Anne walked in carrying something that made everyone in that room go silent: a red folder. It was thick, sealed, and marked with language that's almost never used except in the most serious constitutional emergencies. She didn't sit down. She placed it on the table in front of the king and started talking. For years, the family had endured public pressure, reputation attacks, and private disagreements. They'd shown patience, they'd shown restraint. But what was documented in that folder crossed a line that patience couldn't fix. This wasn't about image anymore. It wasn't about media narratives or personal grievances. It was about two children being left in legal and emotional limbo. What was inside that folder would explain everything. The first section documented the school situation in detail. The children had been removed without formal notice. No transfer destination provided. No alternative education plan submitted. But it also revealed something else. Written instructions from Meghan Markle's legal team had been sent to multiple institutions, explicitly blocking any further communication with royal education representatives. It wasn't just withdrawal, it was isolation. The second section covered the medical cancellations. Multiple routine pediatric appointments had been terminated abruptly, but buried in those records was something that stunned everyone. There were no replacement providers anywhere. No continuity of care, no emergency explanations. Nothing. It was as if someone had decided these children simply didn't need medical oversight anymore. In safeguarding terms, this was considered a serious interruption of duty of care. For professionals who'd spent decades working with vulnerable children, the pattern was unmistakable and deeply troubling. And then came the financial documentation. This is where jaws literally dropped. A trust fund worth over £6 million, established specifically for the children's future education in the United Kingdom, had been dissolved. The paperwork was complete, the funds had been redirected, and there was no indication that anything had been set up to replace it. One advisor asked the question everyone was thinking: why would you dismantle a child's educational future while simultaneously pulling them out of school? The answer came in the last document in that folder. It was an intelligence memo dated January 29th. And unlike everything else, this wasn't about actions already taken. This was about intent. For 4 months, analysts had been watching a pattern emerge. Meghan Markle wasn't just stepping back from parenting. She was methodically preparing to exit entirely. The evidence was everywhere once you knew where to look. References to the children in public materials had been quietly disappearing. Family-oriented branding softened, then vanished. Social media posts that once featured subtle mentions of motherhood became focused entirely on personal projects. It was subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but consistent enough to show it was deliberate. Then came the contracts. Negotiations with a Dubai-based media financier revealed plans for a solo brand launch. The language was clear: personal reinvention, narrative separation, removal of all past family associations. Draft agreements showed someone preparing to rebuild their public identity completely independent of any family narrative. One clause specifically requested the elimination of all historical identifiers that could tie future projects to royal lineage. At the same time, internal correspondence showed a deliberate refusal to participate in Prince Harry's proposed joint custody framework. The language wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Terms focused on minimizing obligations, limiting coordination, and avoiding long-term commitments beyond what was strictly enforceable by court order. But here's what really sealed it. Internal documents from Archwell showed explicit instructions to remove Archie and Lilibet from all future Spotify and Netflix materials by mid-2026. Their names, their images, their entire existence in the public narrative. Gone. No replacement narrative was offered. No transitional messaging proposed. It was as if the children were being systematically phased out of existence. One legal expert in that room put it plainly: this isn't co-parenting. This is erasure. What disturbed senior advisors most wasn't the ambition behind these moves. It was the timing. These preparations coincided exactly with the dismantling of the educational and medical structures that had anchored the children's daily lives. Education withdrawn, healthcare interrupted, identity removed from public record, financial safeguards eliminated. Taken together, the pattern suggested something far more serious than career realignment. It suggested complete exit. When Prince William was briefed, he read through everything in complete silence, page after page, no interruptions, no visible emotion. When he reached the end, he looked up and said something that defined everything that followed. "This is no longer about her. It's about protecting two children emotionally, legally, and historically." That statement removed any hesitation. Within hours, decisions were made that hadn't been made since the abdication crisis of the 1930s. The Crown invoked emergency guardianship provisions, not as punishment, as protection. Princess Anne authorized the activation of emergency custodial safeguard procedures. These mechanisms exist for precisely one purpose: to intervene when a royal child's continuity is at risk due to the actions or inactions of a guardian. The children's passports were placed under immediate security restriction. This wasn't about confinement, it was about containment, ensuring the children couldn't be relocated beyond reach while legal proceedings were underway. A 5-year image protection order was issued under the Windsor Privacy Act. Any commercial or promotional use of the children's names, likenesses, or narratives was immediately prohibited without explicit Crown approval. Streaming platforms, publishers, and licensing partners were notified through legal channels. The message was unmistakable: these children are not commodities. And then came the financial response. Prince William authorized the creation of a £12 million restoration fund, not for public relations, for recovery. The fund was dedicated to emotional stabilization, educational continuity, and long-term reintegration within a protected environment. Therapists specializing in cross-cultural identity trauma were retained. Educational planners were tasked with rebuilding structure without disruption. This wasn't temporary. This was a commitment to rebuilding what had been systematically torn apart. As all of this unfolded, Prince Harry submitted a request for temporary custodial authority. According to multiple sources, the request was reviewed and declined within hours. The reasoning was procedural, not personal: unresolved residency issues, travel limitations, insufficient independent resources to meet safeguarding standards. The decision was communicated without commentary. Custody, guardianship, and protection of Windsor children would remain solely under Crown protocol. For Harry, it was a crushing realization. He was no longer making decisions. He was watching them being made for him. Here's what makes all of this even more striking. While all this was unfolding, Meghan Markle was photographed on a luxury yacht in Doha, smiling, relaxed, in the company of media investors. To the outside world, the images suggested confidence and freedom. To those monitoring the situation, they confirmed distance. Not just geographic, but emotional. No inquiries were made about the children's location. No formal objections filed against the guardianship measures. No appeals submitted during the critical early window when influence might still have mattered. Inside royal briefings, the contrast was noted with deep unease. While systems were being mobilized to stabilize two young lives, the primary parent of record remained unreachable. Requests for clarification were sent through formal legal channels. They were acknowledged, then left unanswered. Statements were drafted, revised, and ultimately withheld. What emerged instead was silence, deliberate and absolute. For palace officials, this absence of response was more revealing than any public denial could have been. But here's where the story takes a turn that still puzzles people today. Only after custody had been lost, only after the Crown had already taken action, did Prince Harry start making accusations. Shocking ones. Claims involving Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew. Allegations raised not during negotiations, not during mediation, but only when it was already too late to change anything. Why then? Why wait until your authority is gone to speak up about something that serious? Nobody has answered that question yet. And until those answers emerge, there's a piece of this story that remains unresolved and deeply unsettling. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening inside Windsor, something that didn't need press releases or legal filings. Princess Catherine took on a role that required no announcement. She adjusted her schedule. She coordinated with child psychologists experienced in identity disruption and displacement. She insisted on consistency over intensity, normalcy over narrative. The goal wasn't to explain the crisis to a child. It was to remove the sense that life itself had become unstable. Those close to the process described Catherine's approach as deliberate restraint. No dramatics, no forced bonding, just presence. And then Princess Charlotte became part of that process. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was discussed carefully among senior advisors and child welfare specialists. Charlotte wasn't asked to perform. She wasn't instructed to represent anything. She was simply encouraged to be what she already was: family. The two girls were introduced gradually through shared routines rather than formal meetings. Meals together, walks in the garden, quiet moments where conversation was optional, not required. No cameras, no expectations, just companionship. What emerged was natural. Charlotte, already accustomed to the rhythms of royal life, became a point of calm, not through authority, but through familiarity. One palace aide later observed that this was the most important phase of the entire operation. Legal authority could be imposed in an instant. Emotional trust could not. As days passed, the change became visible. Lilibet's anxiety eased. Her sleep patterns stabilized. Her drawings, once described as fragmented and unsettled, softened in tone. These details were recorded quietly by professionals, not shared publicly. Inside Windsor, there was a growing sense that something fragile had been caught before it shattered. Then came the photograph. It was released without caption or explanation, just a simple image. Lilibet and Princess Charlotte walking out of Windsor Chapel together, hand in hand. To the outside world, it was a gentle moment. To those who understood the context, it was a statement. The children weren't drifting anymore. They were anchored. The timing of that photograph was precise. It appeared just as legal filings intensified across jurisdictions, just as speculation reached its peak, just as the narrative threatened to spiral beyond control. The Crown didn't counter speculation with words. It countered it with reality. Two children grounded in family, one future protected quietly. On February 11th, the court convened under conditions of exceptional restraint. Proceedings were brief, arguments were limited, evidence, already extensive, was accepted without contest. Meghan Markle was not present. Her legal team confirmed she would no longer participate in the hearing. That absence spoke louder than any defense. The decision that followed was historic. Meghan Markle was formally stripped of all custodial authority over Archie and Lilibet. The judgment cited sustained disengagement, obstruction of welfare oversight, and deliberate severance of educational and medical continuity. In legal terms, it was described as abandonment through omission rather than action. Within hours, Princess Anne addressed the matter in a rare live statement from St. James's Palace. Her words were measured but unmistakable. Any formal influence previously granted is now null and void. The welfare of these children must reflect duty, not ambition. There was no rebuttal from across the Atlantic, no challenge, no appeal, just more silence. What followed was a cascade of institutional consequences. Trust structures previously established outside royal oversight were frozen and dismantled. Financial vehicles tied to the children's names were declared invalid. Commercial agreements referencing Archie or Lilibet were terminated without exception. The children's identities were placed under full royal protection, shielded from licensing, branding, or monetization of any kind. Inside Windsor today, life has returned to something resembling normal. Lessons continue. Gardens are walked, meals are shared. The extraordinary has been folded gently back into routine. Responsibility for the children now rests with Princess Anne, Prince William, Princess Catherine, and Prince Edward as named trustees. Their mandate is singular: protection, stability, continuity. There were no victory statements, no declarations of triumph, of iki. Just the quiet assertion that children born into history will not be abandoned to convenience. But one question still hangs in the air, unanswered and haunting. Why did Harry speak only when it was too late? What was he protecting? Or perhaps what was he finally willing to expose? What connects Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew in accusations that surfaced only after authority had already slipped away? The Crown has acted. The children are safe. Systems have been restored, stability has returned. But the full truth behind this rupture, The allegations left hanging in the air, the timing that makes no sense, that story isn't finished yet.